Hey everybody, welcome back. In this episode, we're going to be starting this series on domains, your first domain. In the other series, we are playing with home lab equipment and home lab setups and a non-domain environment, configuring VMs and the like. And while that series isn't technically over, I do want to flesh out a couple of the series that I hope to be touching on this channel. And with the how far we got in the previous series, I believe that now is a great time to segue into actually creating your domain. So here we have our example server. This server, if you followed the home lab series, is that server. This is the exact server up until the point of the last episode. So today, we're going to be installing, we're going to be configuring and creating our first domain. So basically, when you are creating a domain, what you are doing is you are creating a domain controller. This domain controller becomes the core of that network, and we'll get a little bit, we'll get more into that later. And it creates the forest of your company, of your infrastructure, etc. Basically, a domain is like, think of it, like, it's kind of hard to explain. Think of a domain like a bubble, like your organization, right? And then you have your forest, and your forest is a part inside of the domain that contains all the settings and configuration and options to modify any of the computers that utilize and are attached to your domain. So when you create a domain controller or you create a domain, that first domain controller creates that forest, creates all the basic options, etc., and then you can go back and modify them later. This is known as a PDC, or primary domain controller. However, not to confuse you, PDCs have been fossilized. They're not really a thing anymore. What they are called now is a PDC emulator, and basically that means that this domain, for what it is and how it encompasses today's technological standards, it is a PDC. It's just that, if you ever get asked like a question and it's like a more senior engineer or something like that, it'll probably correct you. Or if you're taking like a test for like a certification, you might get it wrong if you don't say it's a PDC emulator. But for all intents and purposes, it acts exactly the same. So, what do you have to do to create a domain? So basically, you're going to want DHCP and DNS already set up, and we already covered a lot of that in our last series. So what we have to do now is we have to actually install the roles for Active Directory. Thankfully, Active Directory is a very vast beast. It encompasses a lot, it touches a lot, there's a lot that you can bolt onto it. And there are a lot of things that you can install and, integrate with Active Directory. However, to just get a basic Active Directory set up and functioning, it's only one role. There are several that you can choose from, but only one is technically needed to get you on the beaten path. So without further ado, let's open up Server Manager here, and we're going to go ahead and install that role. So we'll go to Manage, Add Roles and Features. We're going to select, obviously, our server DC1. And here we go, in our primary roles, at the very top, we already see them. We have Rights Management Services, Lightweight Directory Services, Federation Services, Domain Services, and Certificate Services. We're going to want Active Directory Domain Services. And it's going to require a couple of other sub features that it wants installed, and we're just going to go ahead and let that happen. And from here, we just hit next and let it install. Now, later, it's going to have us do a bit more configuration, so it's not necessarily this easy, but we'll go ahead and, get that all covered and figured out for you. We're going to let this restart if it's needed, and we're going to hit install. Now, hopefully this doesn't take a super long time. I think the configuration takes most of it, and only because people are generally scared. So while I'm not creating a production domain per se, I'm going to, walk you through a couple of best practices. So if you're the kind of person that follows along and clicks on the boxes that I do and types the things that I do, I just want you to pay a bit more attention to what I'm actually saying versus what I'm actually doing, because I am going to install and configure this so that it is usable for my future examples. I'm going to tell you what some of the best practices are. And I'm going to tell you why I'm making that differentiation as I'm getting there. So after it's installed, we're just going to hit close here. And we're going to go up to our little notification arrow here. And we are going to do our first step. We are going to promote this server to a domain controller. So this is going to kick off our process here. So go ahead and click it. And here we go, our deployment configuration wizard. What are we doing? Okay, so there are 3 different things that you can do initially when doing a deployment configuration, and it's self-evident if you're reading it, but we'll go through them anyway. Add a domain controller to an existing domain, add a new domain to an existing forest, or add a new forest. Now remember, I made that differentiation earlier about how a domain is like your company and a forest are all the things inside of your company, but not necessarily your company as a whole. Think of it like that, because that is what you would do if you were, say, merging a company. Say you worked for a company and your company bought another one. Well, I mean, chances are if you're both businesses, you both probably have a domain. So what do you do in that scenario? Well, what you would do is on the business, on the business that bought, the other business, the business that did the actual purchase would add a new domain to an existing forest. It would take those things, but not the domain itself. It would take those things, and merge it into its forest so that it could control them. Likewise, the first option, add a domain controller to an existing domain, brings us back to a little bit of a best practice. So if you have a company, you generally want more than one domain controller. The reason being is because the domain controller handles a lot of things in Windows environments. It handles your logons. It handles who has rights to access file shares. It does a lot of things to machines, as far as as simple as setting a home page, all the way to running maintenance scripts on, like, say, your hard drive. So it's important that if this machine needs to be updated or suffers a power loss, or maybe a drive fails, whatever may happen to a domain controller that makes it effectively not connected to a network, it's good to have a second. So you would choose the first option to promote another server into that domain so that they can sync up and share information. And then in the event that one of them has to go down for maintenance or some sort of, error or catastrophic damage happens to it, the other one can pick up the tasks. The computers would start asking, the second domain controller if it's allowed to log in, or if it's allowed to access a file share, or if it needs to run, an update. All of that would get deferred. So you always generally want to, as a best practice, and you would select the first option to do that. Now the third, as I'm sure you've guessed, is add a new forest, which is pretty much what we're going to be doing. There's no other option out of those three that says, hey, new, absolutely nothing already here, except for that one. We want to add a new forest because, well, we don't already have a domain, so we can't add this to an existing one, and we're not taking over one, so we just need to create a new one. So we're going to go ahead and hit create a new forest. And this is when we come up with our domain name. Now this is where I go back to what I said earlier about do what I say, not exactly what I do. And what I mean by that is when you create a domain name, it is important that this is thought out. It is important that you understand the networking and protocol standards behind a domain name. Incorrectly, a lot of times on older domains, people do what I'm about to do. And what I'm about to do is the following. My root domain name is going to be tdelab.local. There are a lot of things wrong with this, and I'm going to go through them as quickly as possible, but I'm sorry if this episode's a little long, but it's important to understand. .local is called a TLD. .com is a TLD, .org is a TLD, .net is a TLD, you get it. Domains and the information that pass between them and members of the domain, such as computers or people, rely on DNS, the domain name service. DNS uses the root domain name to pass this information. There are a couple issues that you can run into by using inappropriate domain names that will affect you negatively. One of them is .local. Using a .local TLD is not best practice because .local actually affects other things. Apple devices, for example, do not like being on a domain or being a member of a domain that end in .local. It breaks things for Apples. It also, Apple aside, breaks things that expect .local to do something else. The reality is that when you are creating a domain name, it should be, and ideally it would be, a domain that you own, such as the business that you own. In our case, team.exe.org, I would be using team.exe.org. So why wouldn't I immediately use this? This goes back to DNS as well. You wouldn't ever use a root domain as your domain name. It should always be a subdomain. This is because if I were to use tde.org and I typed it into my web browser, I might not get the website. And I might not get the website because the server, which controls DNS, is potentially going to route me to itself. And this is problematic because now you broke a website, right? The next issue is that if a domain controller likewise wants to talk to another domain controller and it attempts to use tde.org, it might get the website instead of its internal database. This causes a problem. You wouldn't ever want to do that. So it's best to avoid root domain names and it's best to avoid .locals. You should use real TLDs that you own, and you should use real subdomains of a domain that you own. Now, good practice would be something like this. I'm going to type it, but I'm not going to use it. AD for Active Directory .tde.org. That is a perfectly okay domain name. I do not wish to associate my lab server with a domain that I own, and I currently don't have that subdomain, so this won't work. For me, anyway. So I'm going to change it to tdelab.local, which is perfectly fine in the little universe that I've created in Hyper-V. But just understand that this is the absolute worst thing you could possibly do otherwise. So we'll go ahead and hit next now that we've told it we want to make a new forest and we told it a domain name. At this point, it's going to be doing some checks. It's going to do checks all throughout this. Now, you have a couple of different options here. If you have a mixed environment, say this is the only server 2016 server in an environment that is dominated or already controlled by server 2012 servers. Or even worse, what if you don't have a domain but you already have another server 2012 server? You can't go up, you can only go backwards. So if you made a 2016 server the domain controller, you run into these options: function level and domain function level. A function level is basically settings, protocols, restrictions, etc. options. They are options that the domain controller can use, or rather, they are options that are available to your domain. Older operating systems can't go up. Server 2012 won't understand some of the new options that come in Server 2016. Now, if it were the case that I had a 2012 server and I had a 2016 server, but I was creating a domain controller on the 2016 server, if I wanted to make sure that my 2012 server could join and, say, become the second DC, that would be best practice, I would have to make sure at this point to click on this and select 2012 to downgrade it to only use those options that are compatible with 2012. Thankfully, this isn't the case. And even more thankfully, if you mess up, you can change it later. So, with that known, we'll leave it at 2016 because I don't have that problem. The next is domain controller capabilities. If we were adding a domain controller to a domain that already existed, these would not be grayed out. These are grayed out because I told it that it is the first and only domain controller, so it's forcing me to configure it a specific way. Pretty much the only thing that you really want to understand is global catalog, and we'll just go over all of them. The domain name system DNS server. This is going to be, as I said, everything domain is communicated through DNS. We already have DNS server installed on this, and this server already hands out IPs. This server is going to be the root DNS server. Likewise, global catalog is a system that is used by Active Directory to keep track of changes in the domain. That way, all the servers can can sync up. How does one server know what changed on the other server, and how do they stay in sync? This is the mechanism that does that. Since this is the one and only domain controller, that's automatically checked by default. What isn't checked by default would be an option for something like a remote office, or something that's very low bandwidth or isn't on all the time, or something that's just really secure and you can't touch it. And that is a read-only domain controller. A read-only domain controller is a domain controller that you would deploy in a secure environment, an environment in, say, like the middle of the jungle, or an environment that doesn't have a ton of bandwidth. A read-only domain controller does not allow you to make any changes to it, and it does not replicate back to affect the rest of the infrastructure. A read-only domain controller will take in all changes, but it cannot push any. Like I said, there are a couple of different reasons why you would want one, but since we're setting up one domain controller and a new domain controller, it doesn't let us do that because we obviously want it to be able to read and write things. The next is our DSRM password. Directory service restore mode is a mode. Think of it like safe mode. If you're familiar with safe mode on pretty much any computer up until, now, Active Directory also has a safe mode. It is called DSRM, and it is used in disaster recovery scenarios like hard drive failures and you have to try and restore the domain. You have to go into DSRM mode. This is obviously password protected, so pick a good password. In this case, we are going to pick a terrible password. We're going to make a password. All right. Then we'll hit next once we have all those settings all set. And then we're going to run into a delegation for this DNS server. Cannot be created, and that's fine. It says that the parent zone isn't found. If you remember, we actually ran into that when we initially created our DNS server. And this warning is okay because it hasn't attempted to create it yet. So we don't need to worry about it not finding it. So we'll just go ahead and hit next. And this is our Netbios name. The Netbios name is something that we can change but will automatically be generated, which is how we will find things on the network. You could type in / TDE lab and hit enter. And if you had file shares and your computer was part of the domain, you would see those file shares. So we'll go ahead and leave it TDE lab. That's fine. All right, the next is where it's going to set up the Active Directory database and the log files, etc. Leaving these defaults is fine. You're allowed to change them because some very large networks and infrastructures will have these on, like, say, NAS or a SAN. If there are a ton of domain controllers, a ton of machines, and like it's a huge conglomerate, having them on like the C drive of like the hard drive in one server is probably like super slow. But it's totally fine for a lab. So we'll go ahead and hit next. And it's just going to let us know everything that we plan on doing, and we're going to go ahead and hit next. It's going to verify that, it didn't find any like super critical problems that are going to prevent this from working, and then afterwards it's going to let us continue. This generally doesn't take like a super long amount of time, and as you can see, it's going to give us a few warnings. Pretty much all of these are either going to be rectified after the install, or we can fix later. So we'll go ahead and hit install. After this, it's going to welcome us to the domain because the server is going to become part of the domain that it just created. And anytime you join, remove yourself from, or change the name of a workgroup or a domain, you're going to need a reboot. So it's going to ask us to do that after it completes. So just keep that in mind that if you hit install, you're going to need to restart your PC. And now it's securing our registry settings, and you are about to be signed out because this machine needs to be restarted. Now we have our little Active Directory services control here, and this is going to restart. You'll also use the Netbios name, though you can use the full domain name, which is called FQDN, or Fully Qualified Domain Name. That's basically the subdomain, domain, and TLD in its entirety. But you can also use the Netbios name for some software, like say you wanted to access the network share, you could do something like type TDE lab /username, and then your password, and you would gain access to it because, again, you'd be able to find that server using the Netbios name. Now, after you join a domain controller to the domain, you can sit at the group policy service screen for quite a while. It's basically building all of the defaults, and it's building all of the default group policies that your server will utilize and that you can modify and utilize throughout your infrastructure. Your system speed, makes a difference. This, I think I gave 4 cores, and they're also, it's a VM. So this might take like a minute or so. If it doesn't, hurry up here in the next minute, I might pause the video. But otherwise, it generally doesn't take a super long time, but it's definitely a longer boot up than normal. So you're going to want to prepare for that, especially if the machines in your network or in your lab are already relying on this server for DNS and DHCP. They probably can't connect to the network right now, and they're not going to get an address if you've restarted them or just turned them on. So you just want to be mindful of that. And if you have any kind of like streaming service or something going on, like Netflix, or you're gaming, or you're listening to music, streaming it from Pandora, anything that utilizes a heartbeat is pretty much going to fail and disconnect at this point. So you're just going to want to be a little aware of that. Anything with a static IP address is probably going to be fine and connected the entire time because it doesn't need any information from this server. So this is chugging along. I'm going to pause the video here and I'll pick right back up as soon as it's complete. Hey everyone, welcome back. That definitely took a few minutes, but we're logged back in here. As you can see, there's the Netbios name I was talking about. That's how you would generally log into things like network shares. So we'll go ahead and enter our password now. And we'll go ahead and check on a few things. Alright, so let's make sure that we're actually part of our domain. We'll go to local server. And there we go, part of tdelab.local. And let's check DNS because we're definitely going to want to make sure that our part of our our domain's part of DNS now. And here we are. We can see it, no problem. DNSlab.local or TDElab. Wow, what was it saying? We have our reverse lookup zone. Looks like everything came over. We can see our server DC1 at 1.5 is static, so everything's looking good. All right, so with all of that said, I want to kind of tie this episode up. I don't want to throw too much at you. I know that it seems like baby steps, but it's important to, take some of these things slowly, especially if you're a newer system admin and you're looking to do this for like a small business or something. We're going to do something that you're going to want to do early on, and something that you really do want to have enabled, and that is going to be that you want to enable the Active Directory recycling bin. You're going to want to do it. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. And the way you're going to do that is you're going to open up your server manager, and we're going to go to Tools. And we're going to enter the Active Directory Administrative Center. Go ahead and close this. And then we're going to click on our domain, tdelab.local. And right on the right-hand side, we are going to enable the recycling bin. Now, it's important to note that it's good to enable it because this will allow us to restore deleted Active Directory objects, be it users, computers, security groups, etc. But you cannot disable it after it's been enabled. So it's important to know that, but it's also important to know that it isn't going to hurt anything being enabled, and more to the point, when you really need it and you find yourself, up a creek without a paddle, it's good to have it. So we're going to go ahead and hit enable. Are you sure you want to perform this action? Once recycling bin has been enabled, it can't be disabled. Okay. Please refresh the administrative center now. It's been enabled. And this option will also replicate to your other domain controllers. So we'll go ahead and hit the refresh button now, and this is grayed out. Can't interact with it any longer. And you're good. That's it. That's all we're going to cover for now. We'll cover GPOs and adding computers and stuff like that. Actually, you know what? I'll do that for you. The icing on the cake. To end the episode, we are going to join a computer to this domain. We're not going to play with any of the GPOs or anything like that, but we'll go ahead and do it. So, to make it a little more fun, what we're going to do here is we're going to create a domain user. That way, we can see the fruits of our labor here. So you're going to go back to Tools, and we're going to go to Active Directory Users and Computers. We'll go ahead and expand that. So as we can see, in computers, we have nothing right now. In domain controllers, we only have our one. And as for users, we have a couple of the defaults that are enabled, but we're gonna create one. So what we'll do is we are going to right click and we'll go to New User, and we'll say that this is Solaris, and we'll say that there isn't a last name. The username for login will be Solaris, and we'll go ahead and hit next. The password will just be, you know what? I might not be able to do this because it's going to get mad at the default complexity requirements. So we'll try password 1 with an exclamation point and a capital. And just for the sake of doing it, we're going to uncheck user must change this. And we'll hit next, and we'll hit finish, and there we go. We have our user. We're going to just go to properties really quick and make sure that you're a member of domain users. All right, cool. So we have our user. Now, what fun would any of this be if we didn't join a computer to the domain? So let's open up our Windows 10 that we've been dealing with since the first series, our normal home lab one. And as you remember, we've been using the test account. Ugh. So we'll go ahead and log in to test. I believe this is Enterprise. Yeah, Enterprise eval. Let's go see if we can check out the users here really quick. There isn't anyone else except for test. But remember the admin user that we had on the last server? That's your domain admin now. So that account is going to be responsible for joining you to the domain. You can create others that also have that ability, but we're not covering that right now. But let's get this on the domain because that's fun. So we will go to, I just want to go to Control Panel. I mean, we created it, so we have to make sure that it works at least a little bit, right? And we'll go to Set System here. And our current work group is Work Group. It always is. And we'll hit Change. And then to rename this computer or change its domain or work group, click Change. And we're going to say that it is now going to be a member of a domain. And we'll call this tdelab.local. Now it's important to understand though that if you're not already providing DNS and DHCP, this computer isn't going to find your domain. Like if I went on my main desktop right now and tried to join to this domain, it wouldn't happen. So just make sure that, follow the other series. We're kind of picking up assuming that you have a lot of this already done. But follow the other series. You're going to want DNS and DHCP enabled and functioning. So at least make sure you're watching that episode. So we'll hit OK, and it's going to search for and hopefully find our domain controller. And it does. So now what does it want? It wants us to log in to the domain admin account, which was administrator. And our super secret password. It joined it. Welcome to the domain. And again, it's going to want to restart. Okay. Close. Restart later. Workgroup TDE. All right. So we're going to reboot it now. This is the fun part. This is where we get to utilize things that we've done. We'll let this start up here. Why'd I give this so little resources? I'm excited. I want to utilize things that I've created. It's going to make some adjustments internally, which is really why it's going a little bit slow. Like the server, the first boot for anything that joins the domain is a little bit slow while it pulls over and modifies itself to be part of a domain, as opposed to being like an individual, like isolated computer. So things like group policies and stuff are actually built into all computers. Even Home Edition, even though they're not modifiable, you can only join a domain with professional or above as far as Windows versions are concerned. But they do exist in the lesser versions. They're just not, you can't interface with them. So it's doing things like pulling all the new group policies, etc., from the domain controller, as opposed to relying on the ones that were burned in, from the image from factory. So here we can log into our local account, which still exists, or we can select other user now. And what we're going to try and do, right here it says that we're going to be attempting to sign in a TDE lab. We're going to try and log into the user that we just created. So Solaris and super secret password. And with any luck, it'll sign us right in. Nope. Oh no! It's not doing it because it's making me do it because it's a VM. To sign in remotely, you need the right to sign in through remote desktop services. By default, members of the remote desktop users group have this right. Blah. Let's try this. Can I trick it if I do this? Yes. Enhanced session mode enables things, but it also tags it as like an RDP session. And thankfully, and realistically, you wouldn't want a normal user like your cashier to be able to RDP into things using their account credentials. So it's actually stopping us from doing that, because it's basically what this is. Even though we're just double clicking on virtual machines and hitting connect, what it's really doing is kind of like opening up like a little RDP session. So yeah, it's getting ready. It's logging me in using my domain credentials, which is super cool. We'll be able to do things at this point now that this machine's joined, like change the background, automatically deploy file shares, all the cool stuff. So what we can do now is that we are joined to the domain. Let's go back to our DC. And we'll go to computers and we should see this one. Maybe. Apparently it's thinking about it. There we go. So we'll hit refresh. And there we are. There's our desktop. And, what can we do? We can tell the operating system. We can set it to a member of something else. And we can do all sorts of cool stuff. We'll be able to like push GPOs to it now. The world's our oyster now that we have this all configured. So that's where I'm going to end our video today. You've successfully created a domain. You've learned the differences between a best practice and a not best practice domain name. You've learned, the reasoning behind domain names, DNS, and why they're important. You learned why you should have two or more versus, one domain controller. And you've learned the relationship between a domain and how it affects workstations. And then you've taken a workstation, joined it to a domain, created a user in your domain, and then logged in with that user. And we'll just take another quick look at that here really quick, and we'll go to Start and Solaris. We are logged in. So I think that's a great, first step in creating your own domain. We'll definitely cover more and get more intricate as it goes on. But I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned from it. And, stay tuned and look around for the other videos. And we'll try and get you, even further. Have a good one. Bye.